Evaluating Information Sources, LS500. During the semester, we have been talking about information and information sources and reference sources. However, one thing that I have emphasized on is to evaluate information sources, because the problem now in our present time is that we have too many information sources. So the problem is not anymore like it was in the past when we couldn't access information. The problem has become today that we have too much information, and it is very important that we as professionals and our patrons learn and through critical thinking to evaluate information sources, because now we have the internet, we have radio, we have television, we have newspapers, etc., etc. We have a lot of digital information out there that can be reached by anybody who has an internet connection. So the problem then is, how do we evaluate information? How do we know what is good information and what is bad information? Of course, it's never 100% foolproof. But however, we have to make an effort to understand that information sources, especially electronic information sources, have to be evaluated. So the idea is to have relevant, reliable information. Okay? Relevant and reliable information. Information, here we have three types of information, let's say. The first one is disinformation, and this is intentionally false information. So it is information that it's communicated, but it's intentionally false. Then we have misinformation, and this is information that is also false, but it's communicated unintentionally. Okay? So there's a big difference here first in terms of what some people or groups wanted to do. First, disinformation, meaning that they know the information is false, however they communicate that information. With what intentions? I guess I don't know, but they can never be good intentions. Misinformation, it may be somebody or a group that has good intentions, however the information that is being communicated is false. And finally, we have propaganda. Propaganda, of course, it's use of information with the purpose of changing attitude and or public opinion. And propaganda, it's used for politics, for example. So this is one way to see three aspects of the information that we communicate: disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Okay, so we have to be aware, and we have to let our patrons, the information seeker, the user of the library, that he has or she has to be aware that information comes from different places with different intentions, and not everything that is published electronically or even in print in a newspaper or in a book or in a magazine, it's good information. It's reliable information. It may be disinformation, it may be misinformation, or it may be propaganda. So we have to be aware of that. Again, it is important that we recognize that it's not only electronic information. It's not only information that is published in the internet. No, also information that is published in printed sources. It may be, again, misinformation or disinformation, okay, or propaganda. So we have to be aware of that. Not because it is published in a paper or in a newspaper or in a magazine or in a book means that it's good, reliable information. So we have to evaluate. Now, where this information comes from? And if you remember back at the beginning of the semester, we talked about data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Well, but information also comes from primary and secondary sources. Okay, that information, that data that becomes information comes from primary and secondary sources or popular sources or scholarly peer review sources. And we'll see how that affects the type of information that we have to evaluate. And also we will see some examples of primary sources, secondary sources, popular sources, and scholarly sources according to domain, according to discipline. Okay? So the first definition here is what are primary sources, and the definition comes from the Yale University. It says primary sources provide first-hand testimony, and here the idea here, or the key word here, is first-hand testimony or direct evidence concerning a topic under investigation. They are created by witnesses or recorders who experience the events or conditions being documented. So it's somebody who was there when that event happened. That's a primary source. Often these sources are created at the time when the events or conditions are occurring. But primary sources, so it's better, not better, but normally says, or generally says, these primary sources are created at the time when the event took place. But also primary sources include autobiographies, memoirs, oral histories that are recorded later. Primary sources are characterized by their content, regardless of whether they are available in original format, in microfilm, microfiche, in digital format, or in published format. So regardless of the format, they are still considered primary sources. Secondary sources. And here's the definition. Secondary sources are less easily defined than primary sources. Remember, primary sources are first-hand accounts. Generally, they are accounts written after the fact with the benefits of hindsight. They are interpretations and evaluations of primary sources. So you read a primary source, or you watch a movie or a documentary, and then you write something about that primary source. Okay, when we do, for example, lead reviews, and lead reviews are written as from data that is collected out in the field. Well, we are doing a secondary or even a tertiary source. We are writing a secondary or tertiary source. Secondary sources are not evidence, but rather commentary on and discussion of evidence. However, what some define as a secondary sources, and this is what I was just saying, others define it, I guess, as a tertiary source. So it's not a clear definition of what a secondary source is and what a tertiary source is. Context is everything. Note, the definition of a secondary source may vary depending upon the discipline or context. And here are some examples of secondary sources. For example, bibliographies. Also consider tertiary source. Bibliographical works, commentaries, criticism, dictionaries, encyclopedias, also consider tertiary. Sometimes I like to consider bibliographies and reference sources as tertiary sources. However, some people consider them secondary sources. Histories, journal articles, depending on the discipline, can be primary. And this is what I was talking about. If you collect original data, your paper may be considered a primary source. However, in other disciplines, it may be considered a secondary source. Magazine and newspapers articles. And here, in newspaper articles, if it's news and the journalist was there during the event, it may be a primary source, but if it's an article, it may be a secondary source. Monograph, other than fiction, and autobiography. And autobiography, it's a primary source. Textbooks, they are also considered tertiary because they are using secondary sources of information. So in my opinion, again, I would consider textbooks tertiary. and websites. Well, it depends on the website. If you're building up your website with information that comes from another source, then I would consider that a secondary or even a tertiary source of information. Tertiary sources, and here it gets a little bit more complicated, consist of information which is a distillation and collection of primary and secondary sources. And here we have many of our reference materials. We have almanacs, bibliographies, chronologies, dictionaries, encyclopedias, directories, fact books, guidebooks, indexes, abstracts, bibliographies, manuals, and textbooks. And all of these, of course, are what we call the reference collection. These are tools that we have in our reference collection. They may be electronic nowadays, or they may be printed. These are what we consider traditionally to be the reference sources. Not all of, there are other reference sources. For example, and here is not, journal articles are reference sources too, for research reference. But these are the traditional ones. And this is what I mentioned before about how, what sources do we use according to discipline. Of course, these are not disciplines, these are a group of disciplines. This is a broad definition of disciplines. Art and architecture, that would be in humanities, but here is separate. Chemistry, life science, engineering, humanities, social science, and performing arts. So, in art and architecture, a primary source would be a painting, here by Manet, one of the great painters. A secondary source would be an article critiquing the art piece. That would be a secondary source. And a tertiary source would be an art or architecture database. So you can see the distinction in art and architecture. In terms of chemistry and life science, for example, a primary source would be Einstein's diary. A secondary source would be a monograph on Einstein's life. And a tertiary source is a dictionary on the theory of relativity. Okay? In engineering, physical science, a primary source is a patent. A secondary source is a database. A tertiary source is a manual on using the invention. In humanities, a primary source, letters by Martin Luther King. That's a primary source. A secondary source would be a website on King's writing. A tertiary source is an encyclopedia on civil rights movement. Social science, primary source is data, and like I mentioned before, research data is considered a primary source. Here is notes taken by a clinical psychologist. Well, that is data, and that's a primary source. A magazine article about the psychological condition is considered to be a secondary source, and a textbook on clinical psychology is a tertiary source. In the performing arts, we have a movie film in 1942, that's a primary source. A biography of the director is a secondary source, and a guide to the movie is a tertiary source. I think what it is important for us here as in this reference class is that, and I wouldn't say all, but almost all reference tools are either a secondary or tertiary source. We don't use primary source for reference. We use secondary, and most of the time we use tertiary sources of information. Those are reference sources, databases, dictionaries, encyclopedias, manuals, guides, yearbooks, etc. These are tertiary sources, and they are reference sources. What do I need to know, and what will be the best sources or the best source to use? Okay, and here comes the part of evaluating the source. And this is what we have to practice, and this is what we have to teach. Some of you in other classes has told me that most of the reference today in public libraries is electronic reference. I mean, we use the internet, or we use the World Wide Web, and we use Google, and that's where we search for the information. And I say yes, it's fine, but Google is a search engine, and you are going to get many hits when you search for an answer. So how do you choose which one of the hits that you got from the query to answer your reference question? This is when the use of Google becomes problematic. I understand that many libraries may not have the resources to have an electronic or a printed reference collection, or they don't have the time to go through a reference collection to find answers. So it's easier and it's faster to use Google. However, again, Google is a search engine. Google is not giving you the answer. The answer is given by other sources. Google puts them together according to your query. So how, and this is my question for all of you, how are you going to choose, or how are you going to select which one of the hits that you have in your Google search, which one of those sources are you going to use to answer the reference question? And this is where you have to think about scope, audience, currency, specificity, focus, level of scholarship, and format. Okay? And this is the first step for evaluating a reference source, either electronic and or printed. It doesn't matter. And of course, here I would have to put also, and it's not here, but I'm going to put it right now because I think it's very important. It would be authority. Meaning that and let me put it right here. Credentials, academic, and professional. Okay? Because I believe that you have to understand when you select a reference source, you have to see the scope, the audience, the currency, if that information source is up to date, the specificity, the focus, the level of scholarship, and the format. But you also have to search for authority, and authority means the credentials, and that may be academic or may be professional. But credentials are very important in order to choose the right source. Okay, but level of a scholarship is also important, because if you're doing a reference for children, you don't want to use a journal article from the New England Journal of Medicine, right? No, because when they are asking you about some disease or some drug, no, you want to use something that it goes according to their level of scholarship, and that has to do also with audience. Okay, it is very important to currency. especially in terms of when we're using encyclopedias, or when we're using guides, or when we are using maps or directories. Okay, because if we use something that is not current anymore, we may feel that we did our part in the reference transaction, but we are giving misinformation. Okay, we're not doing it on purpose. And here, remember, when we talk about disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, we are not doing it on purpose. We are not giving information, false information, purposely. However, if we're using a resource that it's out of date, we are misinforming our patron, because we are giving an address, or we are giving a name that is, or we're showing a map, or we're telling our patron who is the president of East Timor, and that information is not up to date. So we are misinforming our patron, our client. We are misinforming a person from our community. So it is very important that we evaluate the source. And this is my point. It's not only to look to search in Google. That's fine. You can do that. However, if you're not sure because you haven't evaluated the source, you may be misinforming that information seeker. And we are professionals. We have to give a guarantee of doing a professional work. We have to guarantee our work. And one of the things that we have to do is not misinforming our clients. Here again, how do we evaluate criteria for two information sources? And this is very important here. We talk about format. They may be electronic, they may be printed, scope, purpose, coverage, currency, relation to other works. This is unique, new editions, versions, authority, and this is what I was adding that in the presentation: authors, publishers, sponsors, source of information, treatment, accuracy, objectivity, style, audience, arrangement, sequence, alphabetic, chronological, indexing, cost, price, and license and condition. This is how we evaluate a source. If we're going to buy a reference source for our library, we have to think about the format, the scope, the relation to other works. Is this a new work? Is a new edition? Authority. In our library, in our reference collection, we need to have sources that have authority. And authority means that they are reliable. Okay? Again, it's not only Google. They have to have authority. They have to have reliability. So, in order to not to misinform, but to inform, we need authoritative sources, reference sources, and they have to be up to date. Okay? And we have to understand how they are arranged and how much they cost. And here we have other parameters or other criteria for evaluating a website. And these are very important, especially in today's environment when we are using so much electronic information. But I think it works for any type of information. It may be printed information too. But this is especially true for electronic information, especially now that I have heard that what the type of reference that is being done in public libraries and school libraries and academic libraries is that through Google. And again, a reminder. Google is a search engine. Okay? Google is not a reference professional. We are the reference professionals. So, when we use a website to address or answer a reference question, we have to look for affiliation. And the affiliation means that it has the information there was published by an institution a reputable institution, okay, should support the website without bias in the information. Okay, the audience. Again, audience is very important because you want to match the audience with the answer, or you want to match the audience with information source. A website should be written in at an appropriate level. So there must be a match for a reference transaction to be successful. There must be a match between the audience and the information source. Authority, and this is again, I mean, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself so many times, but for me this is the key here. The website should list the author or the authors with the appropriate credentials. They may be professional credentials, they may be academic credentials. Of course, again, and I said that a few minutes ago, this is not foolproof. Okay? Because you are not able to check the credentials of that person. That person may be, this time it's not misinformation, it's disinformation. That person may be doing disinformation. However, because we don't have any way to check the credentials of that person, we have to, from our side, we have to do the best we can to make sure that in terms of our own professional standards, that information source is reliable. Okay? It's a credible, reliable information source. So we have to go through the evaluation criteria. We might make a mistake. However, we did our best because we evaluated professionally that information source. The problem is when we don't evaluate. Okay, content, currency is very important, because if you don't give the current information, you are misinforming. Design and objectivity. So these are the criteria, the evaluation criteria that we have to have in order to give proper, reliable information to our patrons. Thank you.